Let's get into it. The meat and the potatoes. The exposure triangle. What is the exposure triangle? The exposure triangle is made up of three variables. You got your aperture. You good. You got your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. These three components make up your exposure triangle. I like to compare the components of the exposure triangle to your eyeball. I didn't invent this, I just kind of thought about it, and when I started researching it more, I saw that other people compare it to the eye also. Because if you look on here, it says the aperture is related to the pupil, because the pupil, as it dilates, it gets bigger, and when it contracts, it gets smaller. That's the same thing the aperture does. It opens and it closes. The shutter speed. Who like to take a stab at what the shutter speed would be compared to the eye? Anybody? Any takers? Hey, you ain't got to be afraid. There you go, right over there. Your eyelid. Look at that. She all over your eyelid. And then the ISO, it deals with sensitivity. It's not an actual part of the eye. It's just how, when you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes and they feel like it's kind of stinging a little bit, or you go outside, it's really bright, feel like it's hurting because it's more sensitive to the light. And your camera sensor works just like the eye. The makeup of the camera works just like your eye. The sensor is sensitive to light. It has an eyelid and it has a pupil. That's how it works with the camera. Just kind of remember those when you're out there shooting. And we're going to start off with the aperture. What is the aperture? Right. Oh, and then we have a spot in the back for if you want to take notes. So that way, and I got it on the screen. So if you want to just flip to the note page and just take your notes, or you can take notes wherever you want to take notes, and then you can focus on the slides up here if you want to. The aperture, in its simplest, I like simple stuff. The aperture is just a hole that light go through. That's all the aperture. It's a hole in the lens. The aperture is a part of the lens, because the lens, it can come off. The aperture, it's a part of the lens, and it's just a hole that light goes through. In its simplest form, like we said, I like to relate it to the pupil. When your pupil dilate, it open up. When it contract, or whatever the word is, it close down. The aperture on the lens does the same thing. When you raise your aperture, it opens up. When you lower your aperture, it closes down. All right? And every part of the exposure triangle, they have two functions, a technical function and an aesthetic function. Like I say, today, we're dealing with the technical side. It's all about light. And on the third, we're going to be getting into the aesthetic side, the artistic side. Again, for those that just came in, on the third, we're doing part 2 in this same room. And we're going to be talking about the artistic part of the exposure triangle. So today, we're focusing on the technical side. The technical side for all three of these here is that they control light in some kind of way. They all have the same technical function. They have different aesthetic functions, but they all control light in some kind of way. The aperture, how does it control light? It controls the amount of light that's being let in. And then you see depth of field, that's its aesthetic function. And for anybody that don't know, depth of field is like how much in back or in front of your subject is in focus. You ever seen when somebody took a picture and the background looked real blurry? They shooting with a shallow depth of field. That's controlled by your aperture, but we're going to get into that in part 2. But light, it's the amount of light that's being let in. That's all it is. How much light being let into your camera, right? It's controlling how much light reaches this sensor. And how does it control this? Well, it opens and it closes, like we said. And it's measured in stops of light. How many of y'all know what a stop of light is? Okay, you know what a stop of light is? You know what a stop of light is. For those that don't know or not sure, a stop of light is nothing more than increasing or decreasing the amount of light that's reaching your sensor by doubling the setting. If you double the setting, if you go from here to here, you just doubled the setting. So you letting in one more stop of light. If you cut the setting in half, if you go from here to here, you just cut it in half. So you decreasing the amount of light by one stop of light. So a stop of light is nothing more than increasing it by doubling it or decreasing it by cutting it in half. That's a full stop of light. And of course, you got increments in the middle, a third of a stop and all of that. And it gets kind of confusing sometimes because the aperture and the shutter speed is actually a fraction. The aperture is rarely shown as a fraction like it's shown in here, f over 2.8, but it is a fraction. On most cameras, you're just gonna see that 4 or that 5.6, but it's a fraction, and we know with anybody that's good with fractions, the bigger the number on the bottom is, the smaller that number is. And the smaller the number on the bottom is, the bigger that number is. That's why a F2 is bigger than an F8, because it's actually a fraction. Okay, did I lose anybody? Everybody good with that? Okay. And then again, like I say, dealing with the eye. How do you think about controlling it when you're shooting? Well, when you go outside, think about it like this. When you go outside and you've been in here and you go out there, it's gonna be super bright. What's the first thing you're gonna do? You're gonna squint. You're gonna squint. So when your camera go outside and it's super bright, your camera wanna squint. But if you don't shut the aperture down, you ever took a picture and it's just wash white? Because you ain't tell your camera to squint. You gotta tell it to squint. You gotta bring that, you got to make that aperture be a bigger number on the screen. It's actually a small aperture, but if you're shooting at f4 and you walk outside and it's super bright, you might have to bump it all the way up to f16. You want that camera to really squint because there's a whole lot of sunlight out there. And that's why when you go out there, you're taking a picture, you looking good in here, and you walk outside and you take that picture and it's just a white screen. Your whole picture look just like that side of the screen right there. It's just white because you didn't tell your camera to squint. You didn't close that aperture down. And like I say, it's a fraction and it get confusing. So just always remember when you wanna make it squint, it's a fraction. So that number need to be bigger. It's because you want that aperture to close down to let less light in. Right? Everybody still with me? I'm doing good. Any questions on the aperture? Oh man, no question. That means I'm cooking with Crisco. I'm doing real good.